They were the brightest stars of the West Coast, the princes and princesses of the early rock and roll era. The Collins kids were victims of a robbery in plain sight, but the loot wasn't cash or diamonds, it was their childhood. Larry and Lorrie were perfectly packaged products, honed to satisfy the public's thirst for entertainment. They were thrown from the sandbox onto the stage, forced to grow up before they had time. Why was a heavy guitar strapped to a small boy's shoulder, threatening to crush him? Why was a girl made to support her entire family financially? Beneath the glittering masks lay a ruthless machine that created and nearly destroyed two of the 20th century's most brilliant talents. It began in a place where dreams are often suffocated by the sheer difficulty of survival, Creek County, Oklahoma, the early 1940s. The Great Depression was technically over, but its ghost still haunted the American heartland. It was a world of hard labor, of calloused hands, and of silence. Lawrencine May Collins, whom the world would know as Lorrie, was born here on May 7, 1942. Her brother, Lawrence Larry, followed 2 years later on October 4, 1944. They were born into a dairy farming family near the town of Sapulpa. The psychology of the Collins family was forged entirely by the Okie experience. Even though they were not destitute refugees of the Dust Bowl like the Joad family in The Grapes of Wrath, the cultural memory of that hardship was baked into the soil. In Oklahoma, you didn't work for passion, you worked for survival. You worked to ensure that tomorrow you had food on the table. Children were not exempt from this equation. On a dairy farm, everyone had a job. Everyone had utility. If you could walk, you could work. This utilitarian view of children is crucial. It wasn't cruelty. It was the pragmatism of the plains. Lawrence and Hazel Collins, the parents, were tough people. They loved their children, certainly, but they also saw them through the lens of potential. In a world where the only way out was up, any talent, any spark of uniqueness was something to be nurtured, yes, but also something to be utilized. And the sparks appeared early, terrifyingly early. Lorrie was the first to reveal herself. By the age of 8, she wasn't just humming nursery rhymes. She possessed a voice that seemed to belong to a woman 3 times her age. It wasn't the thin, reedy voice of a child. It had resonance. It had power. It had a vibrato that could shake the rafters of a local church. In Sapulpa, a voice like that doesn't stay hidden. Hazel Collins, recognizing that her daughter had something special, began entering her in talent contests. This was the first step on the treadmill. A talent contest in 1950s Oklahoma wasn't just a fun afternoon. It was a proving ground. It was where you learned that your worth was tied to applause. It was where you learned that smiling even when you were tired earned you a ribbon. Lorrie won. She won constantly. She won a contest in Tulsa hosted by the legendary Western swing band leader Leon McAuliffe. This wasn't a school pageant. McAuliffe was a professional, a steel guitar pioneer. For him to recognize talent in a preteen girl was a significant validation. It was the first hit of the drug that would consume the family, the intoxicating possibility that these children could be a ticket out of the dairy farm. Then there was Larry. If Lorrie was the voice, Larry was the engine. He was smaller, quieter, perhaps more intense. He watched his sister. He saw the attention she garnered. And he picked up a ukulele. It was a toy, really, but in his hands it became something else. He didn't just strum it, he attacked it. He had a rhythmic sensibility that was innate, a sense of timing that couldn't be taught. By the early 1950s, the Collins family faced a choice. They could stay in Oklahoma, milking cows and watching the horizon, hoping the price of milk held steady, or they could gamble. They could take the raw ore they had discovered in their own living room, the voice of the girl and the rhythm of the boy and take it to the one place where raw ore could be refined into gold. They looked west. Just as thousands of Oklahomans had done a decade prior, they looked to California. But they weren't going to pick fruit. They were going to harvest fame. The migration to Los Angeles in 1953 was the crossing of the Rubicon. Once the farm was sold and the car was packed, there was no turning back. They settled in the burgeoning suburbs of Southern California, a world away from Sapulpa. Los Angeles in the 1950s was a strange hybridized beast. On one hand, it was the center of Hollywood, the dream factory of the silver screen. On the other, it was becoming the unexpected capital of country music. The massive migration of workers from the South and Midwest during the war and post-war years had brought their culture with them. They didn't want Sinatra, they wanted fiddles. They wanted steel guitars, but this was California country. It wasn't the polite church-going country of Nashville. It was the Bakersfield sound in its infancy. It was louder, it was amplified. It was played in massive dance halls for rowdy oil workers and sailors who wanted to dance and fight. It was music with a sharp edge. This was the environment Lawrence and Hazel Collins dropped their children into. It wasn't a playground. It was a gladiator arena. The parents wasted no time. They were now managing a small enterprise. The family business was no longer dairy. It was Larry and Lorrie. The pressure to succeed was immediate. They weren't just kids with a hobby. They were the family's investment strategy. And the children delivered. They adapted to this new neon-lit world with frightening speed. But adaptation comes at a cost. To survive in the adult world of entertainment, Larry and Lorrie had to shed the skin of childhood. They had to learn professionalism. They had to learn that tired was not an excuse. They had to learn that I don't want to was not in the vocabulary. It is here, in the cramped living room of their California rental, that the tragedy begins to take shape, not with abuse, not with violence, but with the slow, methodical erosion of normalcy. Larry, now around 9 years old, had graduated from the ukulele to the guitar, but he wasn't learning home on the range. He was listening to the radio. He was hearing the new sounds of R&B, the frantic picking of bluegrass. He practiced obsessively, or perhaps he was made to practice obsessively. The line between a child's passion and a parent's enforcement is often blurry in the histories of prodigies, but the result was undeniable. Larry was becoming a monster on the fretboard. Lorrie, entering puberty, was being shaped into something else. She was being molded into a visual ideal. The parents, particularly Hazel, began to craft the look, the fringe, the rhinestones, the outfits were handmade, elaborate, and expensive. They were costumes designed to catch the light, to make the children larger than life. The psychological weight of this transformation was immense. When you are 10 years old, your identity is fluid. You are figuring out who you are. But for Larry and Lorrie, their identity was being dictated to them. You are the Collins kids. You are the energetic one. You are the pretty one. You are the performers. There was no space left for Larry, the boy who likes comic books, or Lorrie, the girl who likes to draw. Those versions of themselves were not profitable. They were suffocated by the Rhinestone Cage. And then, in 1954, the cage door locked. They heard about an audition for a show called Town Hall Party. It wasn't just a local gig. It was the Grand Ole Opry of California, but wilder, looser, and more dangerous, the true coliseum of West Coast country music, where legends like Tex Ritter held court. To get on Town Hall Party was to make it. To fail was to go back to obscurity. The car ride to the venue must have been thick with tension. The stakes were absolute. They weren't just auditioning for a spot on a show. They were auditioning for the right to stay in California. They walked into the massive barn in Compton. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke, beer, and high-voltage electronics. It was a place for grown-ups, for songs about drinking, cheating, and the hard road of life. The stage was filled with hardened professionals, men with scars who had been playing honky-tonk since before Larry was born. And into this room walked a 12-year-old girl in a fringed skirt and her 10-year-old brother, barely 4 feet tall, holding a guitar that looked like it might topple him over. The room went quiet, not the respectful silence of a church, but the skeptical silence of a saloon. The seasoned pros likely smirked. They saw another kiddie act, another pair of cute amateurs dragged in by delusional parents. They expected Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or You Are My Sunshine. They expected cute. They expected mediocre. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The fuse had been lit in Oklahoma, but the dynamite was about to explode in Compton. Larry Collins looked at his sister. She nodded. And then the boy stepped on the gas. They didn't play a nursery rhyme. They didn't play a polite country ballad. They launched into a boogie-woogie rhythm that hit the room like a physical blow. Larry didn't strum the guitar. He attacked it. His small fingers flew across the fretboard with a speed and precision that defied physics. He wasn't playing like a child learning his scales. He was playing like a man possessed. And then Lorrie opened her mouth. The voice that came out of that 12-year-old girl was a contradiction in terms. It had the innocence of youth, yes, but underneath it was a growl, a rhythmic hiccup that was pure rock and roll. She wasn't just singing the notes, she was selling the song. She stomped her foot. She shook her shoulders. She commanded the stage with a terrifying confidence. The room didn't just clap, it erupted. The skepticism evaporated in seconds, replaced by a kind of frenzied delight. The audience roared. The producers, watching from the wings, realized instantly what they had. This wasn't a kiddie act. This was lightning in a bottle. They were hired on the spot. And just like that, the trap snapped shut. The transformation was immediate. The dairy farm in Oklahoma was 1,000,000 miles away now. The Collins family had struck oil. Larry and Lorrie were no longer just children. They were now professional cast members of the biggest country music show on the West Coast. But survival in this new ecosystem required adaptation. They needed to evolve. And to evolve, they needed a creator. Enter Joe Maphis. If the Collins parents provided the ambition, Joe Maphis provided the ammunition. Maphis was a regular on Town Hall Party, known as the King of the Strings. He was a virtuoso's virtuoso, a man who could play anything with strings, faster than anyone else alive. He was famous for his custom-built Mosrite double-neck guitar, a beast of an instrument with 2 necks, allowing him to switch between standard guitar and a high-pitched octave guitar instantly. Maphis saw Larry Collins not as a cute kid, but as a blank canvas. He saw a boy with frightening dexterity and an eagerness to please. He took Larry under his wing, but this wasn't a gentle mentorship. It was a boot camp. Maphis began to mold Larry in his own image. He taught the boy his signature style, the rapid-fire picking, the hammer-ons, the frenetic energy. He taught Larry that speed was king. And then, the ultimate symbol of their bond, and Larry's burden, was created. A miniature double-neck guitar. It is one of the most iconic images of 1950s music. The master and the apprentice, standing side by side with their matching double-neck guitars. It was a brilliant visual gimmick. It delighted audiences. Look, it said, a mini Joe Maphis. Yet the sheer physics of the instrument were brutal. That guitar was heavy. It was cumbersome. Strapping that instrument onto a 10-year-old boy's shoulders night after night was a physical ordeal. Larry had to learn to navigate 2 necks, switch pickups, and keep up with Mathis's blistering tempos, all while dancing around the stage to keep the audience entertained. This was the creation of the Collins Kids sound. It was frantic. It was high octane. It was relentless. Larry wasn't allowed to play slow. He was the finger-pickin' wonder, and wonders don't take ballads. He was being trained to function as a machine that generated applause through sheer velocity. While Larry was being turned into a musical cyborg, Lorrie was undergoing a different kind of transformation. Lorrie's role was to be the anchor. If Larry was the chaotic energy, Lorrie was the magnetic center. But the industry didn't quite know what to do with a girl her age. She was in the awkward in-between years, no longer a little child, but not yet a woman. So they invented a persona for her. She became the rockabilly sweetheart. The wardrobe department, often her mother Hazel, dressed her in elaborate fringed Western wear. It was wholesome on the surface, covering her from neck to ankle, but the performance was something else. Lorrie was studying the R&B singers. She was listening to the way they growled, the way they used rhythm. She incorporated a hiccup into her singing, a breathless, excited yelp that became a staple of the rockabilly sound. But there was an uncomfortable undercurrent to her stardom. She was a pretty girl, getting prettier by the day. The songs she was given to sing were often about romance, about boyfriends, about dating. Beetle Bug Bop, Hush Money, Make Him Behave. They were innocent titles, but they placed her in the context of romantic pursuit. The audience, largely male, watched her with a fascination that blurred the lines. She was safe to look at because she was just a kid, but she sang with the fire of a woman. She was becoming a projection screen for an industry that loves to commoditize youth while pretending to protect it. By 1955, the buzz was deafening. The Collins Kids were the hottest act on the West Coast. And then the call came from the mountaintop, Columbia Records. This was the pinnacle. Columbia wasn't a small regional label. It was the home of Frank Sinatra, Doris Day, and Tony Bennett. It was the corporate giant of the music world. Signing with Columbia meant national distribution. It meant fame. It meant money. As minors, Larry and Lorrie held the talent, but their parents held the pen. In the eyes of the law and the contract, the children were assets. The parents were the managers. This dynamic enshrined in ink solidified the power structure of the family. The parents now worked for the children's success, but the children worked for the parents' survival. But Columbia Records had a problem. They had signed these two explosions of energy, but they didn't know how to categorize them. Were they country? Were they pop? Were they a novelty act? The producer assigned to them was Don Law, a legendary figure who had recorded Robert Johnson. Law understood the raw power of their sound, but the marketing department had other ideas. They looked at Larry and Lorrie and saw the Kiddie Act. This label, the Kiddie Act, would become their golden handcuffs. It meant they got the bookings. It meant they got on TV, but it also meant they weren't taken seriously. While Carl Perkins and Gene Vincent were being hailed as rock and roll revolutionaries, the Collins Kids were treated as a cute sideshow. They were novelty. And in the hierarchy of art, novelty is disposable. But if you strip away the marketing, if you ignore the cute outfits and the kiddie label, and you just listen to the tapes from 1955 and 1956, you hear something shocking. You hear undeniable greatness. Tracks like Hush Money and Beetle Bug Bop are not children's music. They are feral. The musicianship is terrifyingly good. Larry's guitar solos cut through the mix like a razor blade. He plays with an aggression that sounds like he's trying to break the instrument. Lorrie's vocals are brimming with attitude. She sounds sassy, confident, and entirely in control. They were pioneering a sound that didn't have a name yet. It was the West Coast rockabilly sound, lighter than the Memphis Sun Records sound, faster than the Nashville sound. It was the sound of hot rods and sunshine and teenage adrenaline. And they were doing it live in 1 or 2 takes. There was no auto-tune, no digital editing. They had to be perfect. And they were, because they had no choice. The signing with Columbia kicked the machine into overdrive. Now, it wasn't just Saturday nights in Compton, it was touring. Life for 11-year-old Larry Collins was no longer a childhood. It was a grueling itinerary. School was something that happened in the margins with tutors or correspondence courses. His real education was the highway. He was living on a bus surrounded by adult musicians who drank, smoked, and lived hard lives. He was exposed to the rough underbelly of the entertainment world before he had even hit puberty. He had to be on every night. He had to jump, smile, and play those lightning-fast solos perfectly, whether he had a fever, whether he was tired, or whether he just wanted to go home and play with toy soldiers. Lorrie, meanwhile, was learning that her smile was currency. She was the diplomat of the duo, the one who kept the image bright and shiny. But cracks were beginning to form in the architecture of this illusion. The sheer physical exhaustion was brutal. They were children doing a man's job, unable to say no because their manager was their father and their wardrobe mistress was their mother. There was no separation between work and home. The business was the family, and the family was the business. By 1957, the Collins kids were national stars, undisputed princes of the youth market. But the machinery was running up against a saboteur that no contract could outlaw: biology. Lorrie was 15, then 16. The cute little girl in the cowgirl outfit had vanished. In her place was a young woman with dark, soulful eyes and a charisma that could stop traffic. She was becoming stunningly, dangerously beautiful. To her parents, Lawrence and Hazel, this wasn't a joy. It was a threat. The act relied on the gimmick of the kids. If Lorrie became a woman with autonomy, the delicate balance of the act and the family income would collapse. They needed her to remain the doll in the box. But you cannot keep a hurricane in a jar, and you certainly cannot stop a 16-year-old girl from falling in love, especially when the boy she falls in love with is the Prince of America. His name was Ricky Nelson. The gravity of this moment was defined by Ricky Nelson's status. He was American royalty, the son of Ozzie and Harriet, the teen idol before the term truly existed. He was safe, rich, and beautiful. But like Lorrie, he was trapped. He was a bird in a gilded cage, managed by a controlling father, singing rock and roll to convince himself he was free. When their orbits collided in late 1957, the attraction was nuclear. For Ricky, Lorrie was a revelation, a rockabilly queen with dirt under her fingernails, so unlike the vapid actresses on his father's show. For Lorrie, Ricky was the prince who understood the loneliness of the hotel room and the pressure of the red light. They were two refugees from the land of child stardom, finding solace in each other's arms. In a fair world, they would have been the king and queen of the prom. They would have recorded duets and ruled the charts. But the world of 1950s showbiz was a feudal system, and the lords of the manor, the parents, were not about to let the serfs run away together. The opposition came from both sides, swift and brutal. On the Nelson side, Ozzie saw Lorrie as a distraction. She was too country, too loud, too provocative for the wholesome Nelson brand. But the resistance from the Collins side was even more desperate. Lawrence and Hazel looked at Ricky Nelson and saw a thief. The Collins Kids Act was a binary system. Without Lorrie, Larry was just a novelty act. Without Lorrie, the booking fees dropped. To the Collins parents, this romance wasn't just a teenage crush. It was a hostile takeover of their primary asset. It was an existential threat. The intervention was psychological warfare. Though no transcripts of the arguments exist, the pressure exerted on Lorrie is easy to reconstruct. They played on Lorrie's sense of duty. Think of your brother. Think of the family. We sacrificed everything to bring you to California. Are you going to throw it all away for a boy? They used guilt. They used fear. They restricted her access. It is a tragedy, as old as time, Romeo and Juliet, but stripped of the poetry and replaced with record contracts. They weren't fighting for their family honor. They were fighting for their 15% commission. The relationship was suffocated. Slowly, painfully, the parents tightened the screws. Ricky, governed by his own domineering father, couldn't save her. He was just a boy himself, fighting his own battles for autonomy. The breakup, when it came, was devastating. For Lorrie, it was the final confirmation of her powerlessness. She had conquered the stage. She had charmed millions, but she couldn't choose who to hold hands with. And watching all of this was Larry. While Lorrie was the center of the conflict, the boy standing next to her was absorbing every blow. Larry was 14 years old. He idolized his sister. He idolized Ricky Nelson. He watched his sister's heart get broken by the very people who were supposed to protect her. He watched the machinery of the business crush the spirit of the person he loved most in the world. What does that teach a 14-year-old boy? It teaches him that love is transactional. It teaches him that talent is a trap. It teaches him that the guitar in his hands isn't an instrument of joy. It's the lock on the cage. The dynamic on stage began to shift. If you watch the performances from 1958, the technical proficiency is still there. Larry is faster than ever. Lorrie sounds better than ever. But there is a hardness creeping into the eyes. The smiles don't quite reach the surface. They were performing happiness while living in a state of emotional siege. Lorrie Collins realized she had to escape. She knew she couldn't just quit. As a minor, her parents had total legal control. She couldn't run away. The police would just drag her back. But in 1959, there was one legal loophole for a teenage girl who wanted to emancipate herself: marriage. If she got married, she was legally an adult. She was free. Since the door to Ricky Nelson had been welded shut, she looked for the nearest exit. She found him in the form of Stu Carnall. Stu Carnall was not a prince. He was Johnny Cash's road manager, a hardened industry veteran nearly 2 decades older than her. To the outside world, it was a shocking mismatch. The 17-year-old rockabilly princess and the middle-aged road dog. But to Lorrie, Stu Carnall wasn't a romantic ideal. He was a getaway car. In 1959, the same year the music died in a frozen Iowa cornfield, taking Buddy Holly and Richie Valens, Lorrie Collins detonated her own explosion. She eloped with Stu Carnall. It was an act of rebellion so absolute that it shattered the Collins family dynamic overnight. Lorrie likely told herself this was love, or at least a life where she wasn't treated like a child. But in her desperation to escape one cage, she had simply walked into another. She had swapped the gilded prison of her childhood for a wedding ring, stepping out of the frying pan of her parents' ambition and into the fire of the professional touring circuit. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The Collins kids were built on the fragile illusion of eternal youth, but a married woman cannot be a kid. A 17-year-old wife touring with a husband twice her age disrupts the fantasy. Lawrence and Hazel were not just devastated parents. They were managers in cold panic. Their leverage was gone. The binary star system had been cleaved in two. The act tried to limp on, fulfilling contractual obligations on a town hall party that was itself gasping for air. but the chemistry had curdled. Lorrie was now living in a different world, the gritty, amphetamine-fueled reality of Johnny Cash's road tours. She was no longer protected by the family bubble. She was a teenage wife in a world of hard men. And then in 1961, the final nail in the coffin arrived. Lorrie gave birth to her first child. In the conservative landscape of country music, a teenage mother was not a marketable commodity for a youth act. The cognitive dissonance was too great. You couldn't sing hop, skip, and jump while rocking a cradle. For the first time in her life, Lorrie made a choice that was truly hers. She looked at her newborn child and decided that this small private life was more important than the applause. She stepped back. She retreated into domesticity. It was a heroic act of self-preservation. She was reclaiming her humanity. She was refusing to let the industry consume her next generation. But in saving herself, she inadvertently left someone behind. What happens to a binary star when one sun goes supernova and vanishes? The other is left spinning in the dark. Larry Collins was 16 years old. He had spent his entire conscious life as Lorrie's little brother. His entire identity was constructed around being the frantic foil to her beauty. He was the finger-pickin' wonder. He was the sidekick. And suddenly, he was alone. He was a virtuoso without a singer, a prodigy without a platform. He was a 16-year-old boy who had never been a boy, holding a double-neck guitar that was now a relic of a dead era. The industry didn't know what to do with him. A solo instrumental guitarist in 1961? The world was changing. The raw, aggressive rockabilly sound was being smoothed out. The charts were filling up with polished teen idols like Bobby V and Frankie Avalon, boys who couldn't play a note but looked great on a lunchbox. Or, worse for Larry, the rise of surf music was just around the corner, a genre that prioritized a completely different guitar sound. Larry was a master of a dying language. He tried to carry on. He released a few solo singles. He tried to sing. But Larry wasn't a singer. His voice was fine, but it lacked the star power, the charisma, the explosive quality that Lorrie had possessed effortlessly. He was the phantom limb of the act. He was moving, he was playing, but the soul of the performance was missing. The silence where Lorrie used to be was deafening. The early 1960s were the lost years for Larry Collins. While the Beatles were rewriting the rulebook of pop music, Larry was stuck in the past. He drifted. He played clubs. He worked on his technique. He retreated into the instrument. This is a dangerous time for a child star. The transition to adulthood is the place where most of them break. We have seen it time and again, the drugs, the arrests, the desperate public meltdowns. Larry avoided the worst of it, perhaps because of the discipline ingrained in him by Joe Mathis. He didn't turn to heroin. He turned to the fretboard. He practiced. He refined. He grew up, but he did it in the shadows. The bright lights of national television were gone, replaced by the dim neon of Nevada lounges. The family, too, was adrift. The golden goose had stopped laying eggs. Lawrence and Hazel Collins had to adjust to a new reality. Their children were no longer their employees. The control was broken. The empire of glitter and grease paint had crumbled into dust. For the next decade, the Collins kids as a national entity ceased to exist. Lorrie was raising children, living the life of a housewife, arguably finding the peace she had been denied. Larry was hustling, a working musician in a world that had moved on. They would occasionally reunite for shows in Nevada, Reno, Lake Tahoe. But these weren't the glory days of Town Hall Party. These were nostalgia gigs, before nostalgia was even a marketing term. They were playing for the people who, like them, had been left behind by the cultural revolution of the 60s. They were playing for the drinkers and the gamblers, The people who wanted to hear Beetle Bug Bop and remember a simpler time before Vietnam, before the Kennedy assassination, before the world got so complicated. It was a humble, grinding existence, a far cry from the Columbia Records contracts and the national tours. Then something unexpected happened. Most child stars, when they hit this wall, they shatter. They become tragic footnotes. They end up in "Where Are They Now" columns. Larry Collins didn't shatter. He germinated. In the silence of his obscurity, stripped of the child prodigy label, Larry Collins began to do something he had never been allowed to do in the cage. He began to listen to his own voice, not his singing voice, but his creative voice. He began to write. He put down the double neck guitar, the heavy symbol of his childhood burden, and picked up a pen. The world had written off Larry Collins. To the industry, he was a has-been at age 25. He was a footnote in the biography of Ricky Nelson. He was a piece of rockabilly trivia. But the industry forgot one thing. Larry Collins was a survivor. He had been trained by the best. He had a work ethic forged in the fires of the Oklahoma dairy farm and tempered on the stages of Compton. He wasn't done. He was just molting. While Lorrie found her purpose in family, Larry was about to find his purpose in a song that would come from a place of deep, gothic storytelling, a song about a woman losing her mind in a small southern town. The boy who had been a puppet was about to become the puppet master. He was about to pull the strings of the entire country music world, and no one would see it coming. The kiddie act was dead. Long live the songwriter. In the American entertainment industry, there is no purgatory more lonely than the life of a former child star. When the cuteness fades, when the novelty wears off, the industry usually offers two paths: self-destruction or invisibility. We've seen it 1,000 times. The child actor robbing a convenience store, the teen idol found dead in a hotel room, the "Where Are They Now" segment that invites the audience to pity the very people they once worshipped. By the early 1970s, Larry Collins should have been one of those tragedies. He was approaching 30. The glittering prison of the 1950s was a distant memory. The double-neck guitar was in a case, gathering dust. The world of rockabilly, the world he helped build, was effectively extinct, replaced by the soft rock of the Eagles and the outlaw country of Waylon Jennings. Larry Collins was a ghost. He was walking through a musical landscape that had no place for him. He was Lorrie's little brother, a relic of a bygone era of innocence. But Larry Collins had a secret weapon. He had the one thing the industry couldn't take away, the one thing Joe Mathis couldn't teach, the one thing his parents couldn't manage. He had a voice, not a singing voice, but a storyteller's voice. While the world stopped watching, Larry Collins stopped performing, and he started writing. The reinvention of Larry Collins is one of the great untold second acts in music history. It happened quietly, without fanfare, in the back rooms of publishing houses and living rooms. Larry had teamed up with a songwriter named Alex Harvey. They were drinking buddies, picking partners, and fellow travelers in the music business. One night, the story goes, Harvey began to sing a melody. It was a mournful tune, steeped in the Southern Gothic tradition of Flannery O'Connor or Tennessee Williams. It was a song about a woman named Dawn. Dawn was a faded Southern belle, a woman who had been promised a life of love, who had been promised that her mansion in the sky was waiting for her. But the promise was a lie. The man never came back. And so Dawn walked the streets of Brownsville, Tennessee, with a suitcase in her hand, waiting for a train that would never arrive, slowly slipping into madness. Larry Collins heard this melody, and he understood it. Few understood the tragedy of faded glory better than Larry Collins. Who would understand the pain of waiting for a promise that turned out to be hollow? Who would understand the feeling of being trapped in a past that everyone else had moved on from? Dawn was 41 years old in the song. Larry was younger, but his soul was old. He poured his own experience, his own rhythmic sensibility into the track. He helped craft the structure, the build, the emotional crescendo. Together they wrote Delta Dawn. And then the universe played its greatest, most ironic joke. The song found its way to a producer named Billy Sherrill. Sherrill was looking for a hit for a new artist he had just signed, a prodigy, a girl with a voice that sounded too old for her body, a girl who was being managed by ambitious parents. Her name was Tanya Tucker. She was 13 years old. History was repeating itself. Larry Collins, the former child prodigy who had been thrust onto the stage at age 10, had written the song that would launch the career of the next great child prodigy. When you watch the old footage of Tanya Tucker singing Delta Dawn, you are seeing a mirror image of the Collins kids. The same precocious talent, the same adult themes coming from a child's mouth, the same machinery grinding into gear behind her. But this time, Larry wasn't the victim in the spotlight. He was the architect in the shadows. Delta Dawn was released in 1972. It exploded. It went to number 6 on the country charts. Then Helen Reddy covered it, taking it to number 1 on the pop charts. It became a global anthem. It generated millions of dollars. Larry Collins had done the impossible. He had broken out of the cage. He wasn't the Collins kid anymore. He was Larry Collins, the hitmaker. He was a man of substance. He had proven that his talent wasn't just a parlor trick of speed and dexterity. It was a deep, creative wellspring. But as Larry's star rose for the second time, the silence surrounding his sister deepened. Where was Lorrie? While Delta Dawn was playing on every radio station in America, Lorrie Collins was living a life of radical normalcy. She was in Reno, she was in California, she was raising her children. She was Mrs. Carnal, and later, after that marriage ended, she remarried and became simply a wife and mother. This was the divergence. For Larry, music was the only way to exist. He had to conquer it to survive it. For Lorrie, music was the thing she had to escape to survive. There is a profound dignity in Lorrie's choice. In a world that tells women their value is tied to their visibility, Lorrie chose invisibility. She chose to be present for her children in a way her parents, consumed by the business, had never been present for her. She broke the cycle of exploitation by refusing to participate in it. But one has to wonder. When she turned on the radio and heard her brother's song, a song sung by a 13-year-old girl who sounded hauntingly like a young Lorrie Collins, what did she feel? Did she feel a pang of regret? Did she miss the roar of the crowd? Or did she just feel relief that it was someone else up there in the unforgiving spotlight? We rarely allow our female icons to just stop. We demand that they entertain us until they die. Lorrie Collins committed the ultimate sin of celebrity. She walked away and stayed away. Larry proved Delta Dawn wasn't a fluke. In 1981, he struck gold again. He co-wrote a song called You're the Reason God Made Oklahoma. It was a duet for David Frizzell and Shelley West. The title itself is a nod to his roots. Oklahoma, the place where it all started, the dairy farm, the dust. The song is a masterpiece of 80s country. It's about two lovers separated by distance, one in the city, one in the country, trying to hold on to each other. It resonated with millions. It went straight to number 1. It was featured in the Clint Eastwood movie, Any Which Way You Can. Once again, Larry Collins was at the top of the industry, but this time, he was invisible. The public bought the record for David Frizzell and Shelley West. They watched the movie for Clint Eastwood and the orangutan. Nobody looked at the liner notes and said, Hey, that's the little boy with the double-neck guitar from Town Hall Party. The industry celebrated the song, but they continued to forget the man. Larry Collins had achieved a strange kind of phantom success. He was rich. He was respected by his peers, but his public identity had been completely erased. The Larry Collins the world remembered was still 10 years old, frozen in black and white, trapped in a kinescope. The adult Larry Collins was a ghostwriter, supplying the emotions for other people to sing, and so the story might have ended there. Two paths diverged: the brother who became a successful invisible craftsman, the sister who became a successful invisible mother. The Collins kids were history, a trivia answer, a do you remember conversation piece for aging baby boomers. But history has a way of circling back. In the early 1990s, something strange began to happen in the underground music scenes of London, Tokyo, and New York. A new generation of kids, punks, goths, and greasers, discovered their parents' record collections. They found the old vinyls, they blew off the dust, they dropped the needle, and they heard it. They heard the ferocity of Hush Money. They heard the proto-punk aggression of Larry's guitar. They heard the raw, unfiltered power of Lorrie's voice. They didn't see cute kids. They saw rebels. They saw rock and roll in its purest, most volatile form. A movement was born, the Rockabilly Revival. It wasn't about nostalgia for the 50s mainstream. It was a celebration of the wild, the weird, and the frantic. And at the top of every DJ's playlist, alongside Wanda Jackson and Gene Vincent, were the Collins kids. The phone rang in Reno. The phone rang in Los Angeles. It was a promoter from England. He didn't want Larry the songwriter. He didn't want Lorrie the housewife. He wanted the Collins kids. He wanted the monsters. He asked the question that had been hanging in the air for 30 years. Can you still do it? Larry looked at his guitar. Lorrie looked at her life. They were in their 50s now. They were grandparents. The Rhinestone Cage had been unlocked decades ago, but the door was still open. And for the first time in their lives, they had a choice. No parents pushing them, no contracts binding them. Just a question. Did the magic still exist, or was it gone forever? They decided to find out. They booked the flight. There is a specific kind of cruelty in the music business reserved for oldies acts. They are usually trotted out like museum exhibits, forced to wear ill-fitting recreations of their old costumes, singing along to backing tracks for audiences who are trying to remember who they used to be. It is a spectacle of decay, a sad pantomime of youth performed by the aged. When Larry and Lorrie Collins boarded the plane to England in 1993, they must have been terrified that this was their fate. They were in their 50s now. Lorrie was a grandmother. Larry was a successful country songwriter who hadn't performed the frenetic rockabilly of his youth in decades. The double-neck guitar had been in its case for a long time. The Collins kids was a name that belonged to two children who no longer existed. They arrived at the Hemsby Rock and Roll Weekender. The backstage area was chaotic. The air smelled of hair grease and stale beer. They were far from the polished studios of Columbia Records. But when the announcer screamed their names, the Collins kids, and they walked out onto that stage, something miraculous happened. Something that defied the laws of biology and the cynicism of the music industry. They didn't just play, they ignited. The time machine worked. Larry's fingers hadn't forgotten a single note. If anything, the years of studio work in the 70s and 80s had made him sharper, more precise. He attacked the double-neck guitar with a vengeance, shredding through the solos of hop, skip, and jump with a speed that left the younger guitarists in the audience with their jaws on the floor. And Lorrie. The voice had changed. The girlish hiccup of 1955 had deepened. It was richer now, darker, textured by 30 years of life, marriage, motherhood, and silence. It wasn't the voice of a rockabilly sweetheart anymore. It was the voice of a rockabilly matriarch. It commanded respect. When she sang Mercy, she wasn't asking for it. She was demanding it. The crowd went insane. These weren't polite applause. This was worship. For the kids in the audience, Europeans who had worshipped the 50s as a mythical golden age, seeing the Collins kids alive and dangerous was like seeing a Greek god descend from Olympus. For Larry and Lorrie, looking out at that sea of adoration, the feeling must have been overwhelming. For the first time in their lives, they were being applauded, not because they were cute, not because they were novelty, and not because their parents had pushed them onto the stage. They were being applauded because they were great. This reunion marked the beginning of an extraordinary Indian summer for the Collins kids. It wasn't just a one-off show. It became a second career. For the next 25 years, a period longer than their original run in the 1950s, Larry and Lorrie toured the world. They played festivals in Europe, massive rockabilly weekenders in Las Vegas like Viva Las Vegas, and intimate clubs. This era represented a profound vindication. They had survived the sequin trap. They had survived the exploitation. They had survived the silence. And now they were rewriting the ending of their own story. The dynamic had shifted. They were no longer the employees of Lawrence and Hazel Collins. They were partners. They made their own set lists. They wore what they wanted. They traveled on their own terms. And most importantly, they found each other again. The tragedy of the 1960s, the phantom limb syndrome, where Larry was left alone, was healed. On stage, they fell back into their telepathic rhythm. Larry knew exactly when Lorrie was going to hold a note. Lorrie knew exactly when Larry was going to extend a solo. They moved around the microphone with a grace that can only come from shared DNA and a lifetime of shared trauma. Watching them in the 2000s and 2010s was a moving experience. You saw the love, not the manufactured sibling act love of the 50s, but the deep battle-hardened love of two survivors who had walked through the fire and come out the other side holding hands. But time is the one adversary you cannot outplay, no matter how fast your fingers are. As the years rolled on, the physical toll of the road began to creep back in. But this time, it wasn't the exhaustion of a child forced to work. It was the natural slowing down of the body. They continued to perform well into their 70s. It was an act of defiance. In an industry that worships youth, the Collins kids were proving that rock and roll has no expiration date. Lorrie Collins, in her 70s, was still cooler, tougher, and more charismatic than pop stars a third of her age. She had become an icon of resilience. She was the girl who walked away to raise her family and then came back to reclaim her crown. But in 2018, the music finally stopped. The news came from Reno, Nevada. Lawrencine Lorrie Collins had passed away. She was 76 years old. The cause was complications from a fall, a sudden and tragic end for a woman who had stood so steady for so long. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the 1960s. That previous silence had been professional. This silence was existential. The other half of the binary star had gone out, and this time it wasn't coming back. The rockabilly world went into mourning. Tributes poured in from around the globe. But amidst the public grief, the focus turned to the man who was left behind. Larry Collins was 73 years old. He had spent 65 of those years playing guitar next to his sister. Even during the years of separation, she was the North Star of his life. She was the reason he picked up the instrument. She was the voice he heard in his head when he wrote Delta Dawn. When Lorrie died, a massive part of Larry died with her. The Collins Kids was not a band that could replace a member. It was a biological and spiritual entity. Larry retreated. He stayed in his home in Santa Clarita, California. The double-neck guitar, the instrument that had defined his childhood and redeemed his old age, sat in the corner. For 5 years, he lived in the shadow of that loss. He watched as the world continued to spin, as new bands played the songs he and Lorrie had made famous. He saw his influence everywhere, in the speed metal guitarists, in the punk rockers, in the country pickers. But the joy was gone. The kid inside him, the one who hopped and skipped and jumped, had finally laid down to rest. On January 5th, 2024, the final note was played. Larry Collins passed away of natural causes. He was 79. He went to join his sister. It is easy to envision the reunion, not on a stage in Hemsby or a studio in Hollywood, but somewhere else, somewhere quiet, somewhere where there are no cameras, no contracts, no rhinestones, just a brother and a sister sitting on a porch, playing music because they love it. Not for the applause, not for the rent money, just for the harmony. The Rhinestone Cage is empty now, the doors swinging in the wind. But as we stand at the end of this long, winding road, we are left with a question. What is the true legacy of the Collins kids? Is it the exploitation? Is it the cautionary tale of child stardom? Is it the tragedy of the love affair with Ricky Nelson that never was? Or is it something else? They were the spark that started a fire. They were the bridge that connected the past to the future. They were two children who took the weight of the world on their shoulders, dressed it up in fringe and sequins, and made it dance. They were the stolen youth of rock and roll, but in the end, they stole it back. So let the record spin. The stage is dark now, and the heavy guitars are finally laid to rest. But if you listen closely to those tracks today, you won't hear victims. You will hear victory. You will hear the sound of two bright stars that refuse to burn out, leaving us with a fire that still feels warm 70 years later. The kids have finally gone home, but the echo lasts forever.